Good to see all of you here today on the Lord's Day. What a blessing to be together. I'm so grateful to be back. We enjoyed our trip. We got to see several members of our family and some friends as well. Last Sunday I had the opportunity to hear my former roommate preach in the congregation where he serves in Middle Tennessee. But there's nothing like being home. So we're so glad to be here with you today. If you've got your Bibles and you want to open up, we're going to be studying from the book of Ecclesiastes this morning. Ecclesiastes chapter 2, beginning at verse 1. Ecclesiastes chapter 2, beginning at verse 1. And once you have turned there, we're going to quote together our theme verse for the year, Psalm 77:11. Psalm 77, let's quote together. I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your wonders of old. We are remembering this year, and we have remembered some mighty acts and memorials. We have remembered some forgotten people and some forgotten books. And this morning we are remembering a forgotten doctrine, the doctrine of happiness through holiness. Happiness through holiness. I want you to pause for a moment and think about your happy place. What is your happy place? In 2011, I served in an internship with a church in West Virginia, and I lived in the home of one of the widows of the congregation, and she had a sun porch that was bigger than most of my house. And she had huge glass windows that looked out on a ravine and what would be a hill in West Virginia, close to a mountain here. And in the morning, my happy place was to make a cup of coffee and go sit on that sun porch and look out the window and reflect and study and pray. What's your happy place? There is a park in California that has been dubbed the happiest place on earth. The search, the pursuit of happiness is common in the modern world. When I was in college at Freed-Hardeman, I first began seeing and hearing this phrase, do what makes you happy. In fact, presumably a student took a piece of chalk and actually wrote that phrase on the side of the brick wall of our cafeteria, do what makes you happy. And then later someone came behind the original artist and added the words, and holy. Do what makes you happy and holy. You know, this pursuit of happiness, it's not a new thing. Solomon says in Ecclesiastes chapter 1 verse 9, there's nothing new under the sun. We're not the first people to pursue and search for happiness. That pursuit is as old as the world itself. And Solomon, the author of the book of Ecclesiastes, knew this pursuit well. In chapter 2, verses 1 through 11, he describes a bit of his own search for happiness. And we're going to look at some of those things that he tried to find happiness in. We're going to notice, though, that Solomon says all of those things were hevel. That's not a bad word. That's a Hebrew word. It means vanity, according to the English Standard Version, or profitlessness, according to the New English Translation, or worthlessness, according to the NIV. In other words, Solomon searched for happiness in all of these things, but he says, every time I came up empty. Every time I came up empty. It was like, he said, chasing after the wind. You'll have as much luck chasing happiness and catching it as you will as trying to bottle up the wind. Now, does that mean we cannot be happy? Well, no. But we will not find happiness if we're chasing after it. And so I want to look at Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 1 through 11 with you this morning and notice some of these things in which Solomon tried to find happiness, and then hopefully as we conclude to notice where we can find a true happiness. First of all, in verses 1 through 3, Solomon tried to find happiness by fulfilling his passions. Hear what he says. I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself. But behold, this also was vanity. I said of laughter, it is mad. And of pleasure, what use is it? I searched with my heart how to cheer my body with wine, my heart still guiding me with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the children of man to do under heaven during the few days of their life. You'll see here several things that Solomon tried under this idea of passion, under this idea of fulfilling the desires of his physical body. It's not said explicitly in verse 1, but within the idea of the word pleasure is probably a reference to Solomon's many wives and concubines, 1 Kings 11, verse 3. In fact, Dan Winkler alludes to that. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later in the sermon. But how many of us are convinced at some point in our life, or how many of us have known someone who is convinced at some point in their life that if they found the right person, they would be happy? How many in the world today are convinced that if only they could achieve their goals on Friday night, I'm not trying to be crass, I'm being realistic about the world, that they would be happy? Solomon says, I tried that. I tried satisfying my body, but I came up empty. He then says, I tried comedy. I tried laughter. I tried, even though God gave me this wisdom above all others, I tried engaging in folly. But the comedy, the hilarity, it didn't satisfy. See, that's the nature of indulging the physical body, isn't it? The body always wants more. We always come up empty. And then he says, well, I tried substances. I tried wine. Now we understand, in fact, when we look at the book of Ecclesiastes on the whole, and we look at its history of interpretation, that it is lauded for its wisdom. And in the discussion of hedonism and all of these things, and determinism, that it is regarded, even among those who do not believe in God or in the inspiration of Scripture, as one of the most important documents in history. Solomon says, it was a heavy thing knowing wisdom. It weighed on me to be wise because I saw so much folly among people. And I saw how much was empty in this world. And so I tried to get away from it with alcohol. And the same author, Solomon, in Proverbs 23 says, I can tell you all of the dangers and all of the displeasure that comes from engaging in alcohol. In fact, he says in Proverbs 23:35, of the drunkard, I think I'll have another drink. The body is never satisfied. It might cover up that longing. It might hide that weight. But he says, in the end, the emptiness is still there. True happiness is not found in the pursuit of pleasure and physical things. But it is found, according to Paul in Philippians chapter 4, beginning at verse 11, in being content with what we already have. Philippians chapter 4, beginning at verse 11, we know that book of Philippians as Paul's book of joy. He talks about rejoicing more in this letter than he does in any of his other writings. And even in verse 10, he talks about rejoicing in the Lord because of the concern of the Philippians for his physical well-being. But he says then in verse 11, not that I am speaking of being in need. For I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I've learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. What's the secret, Paul? I can do all things through Him who strengthens me. Not in delighting in indulging the body, but in trusting in the one who gave Himself for me, Paul says. That is how I know to be content. Chasing passion is a never-ending pursuit that will always leave us empty. But that's not where Paul's search ended. He tried indulging his passions, but he did not find happiness. So he tried seeking progress. Notice what he says beginning at verse 4. I made great works. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks and planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had slaves who were born in my house. Solomon tried to find happiness in his accomplishments, in advancing the culture and the physical things of his kingdom. His projects were varied and widespread. And if you lived in the kingdom of Solomon, the kingdom of Israel, and all of these great advances were made, likely you would say, Solomon has benefited all of us by bringing in these things. Because he did not just build the temple, 1 Kings chapter 6. He did not just build himself a house, 1 Kings chapter 7. But according to these verses, he also built parks. And he built aqueducts that fed water through the city. And so everyone would have benefited from these things. This is true progress, the way that we would consider progress. If we had the opportunity to go back and see what Solomon accomplished from an archaeological perspective, it would be lauded as some of the greatest advances in technology in the ancient world. He was also involved in agriculture. Now that's a given in the world of Israel, but he went beyond the norm, didn't he? We said he had those parks and those aqueducts, not just agricultural efforts for food, but also for beauty and enjoyment. And he was involved in industry. He bought and sold slaves. Now within that was his ability to provide their physical sustenance and obviously to employ them for doing specific types of labor. And yet, these things did not satisfy. True happiness does not come through progress. One of the most progressive civilizations the world has ever known was that of the Roman Empire. Much of the technology that we have today, we owe to ancient Rome. Our system of government is built upon the Roman system of government. Our language, by and large, is built on Latin, the language of the Romans. That we have books that are made up of leaves that are stitched together, bound together. That started in ancient Rome. And so much more that we could point to and say, it's because of the things that Rome accomplished that we have these technologies today. Yet we also have, because of their great advances in technology, we have numerous records of the people living in ancient Rome. We have historical documents about the emperors and about the people that lived in Roman society. And by and large, they were miserable people. They lived miserable lives. Now, by contrast, I had the opportunity from 6th grade through 12th grade to do mission work in Latin America every summer. And on a few of those trips, we went to places where there was no running water. There was no electricity. The nearest store was several miles away, so far that you couldn't walk it on foot in a day's time. But I met some of the most contented people I've ever seen. Their contentment was not in what they had. It was not in the level of education or the level of technology that they knew. It came from somewhere else. And for the Christian, we understand that ultimately our happiness cannot come from progress, but it must come from a right relationship with God. Solomon said, as a source of happiness, progress will always leave you empty. Then notice Solomon also sought to find happiness in his possessions. The last part of verse 7, he says, I had also great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, the delight of the sons of man. Solomon tried to find happiness in the things that he acquired. He gathered livestock and money and entertainers. And in fact, 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 23 says, Solomon was the richest king alive. The suggestion of that text and this one is, if money could buy it, Solomon had access to it. You think about Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, Solomon. There was nothing that money could buy that Solomon did not have access to. How much would it take to bankrupt you physically? $25,000? $50,000? $500,000? I can guarantee every single one of us combined could go bankrupt, and Solomon could have paid the bill with plenty left over. That's how wealthy he was. But he says, those things didn't make me happy. Those things did not fill my longings. In fact, as you come down into the book of Ecclesiastes in chapter 5, verse 10, he says, he who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with his income. This also is vanity. If anyone was qualified to say it, Solomon was, because he was so very wealthy. But he understood by that wealth that true happiness does not come from possessions. Paul writes about the source of true happiness in 1 Timothy chapter 6. He's charging the wealthy members of the congregation in Ephesus. And in 1 Timothy chapter 6, beginning at verse 17, this is what he says to those Christians. As for the rich in the present age, charge them not to be haughty, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. They are to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share. Here it is, verse 19. Thus storing up treasure for themselves as a good foundation for the future. That treasure is not their physical wealth, but in doing those good things and being generous, so that they may take hold of that which is truly life. Paul says, life is not found in wealth, but in the wealth of good deeds on your account. Not that you're earning your way, but you're showing the fruit of the gospel in your life, whether you are rich or poor. As a source of happiness, possessions will always leave you empty. Solomon tried to find happiness in pursuing his passions, but it came up empty. He tried to find happiness in progress, but it came up empty. He tried to find happiness in his possessions. He was the wealthiest man alive, but he came up empty. He tried to find happiness in prominence, that is, in fame, in being well known and recognized. Verse 9 says, So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also, my wisdom remained with me. You recall that God gave Solomon wisdom beyond the wisdom of any other living being. He was the wisest man alive. And he says here, I'm the most famous man who ever lived in Jerusalem. That's the way the CEV puts it. I'm the most famous man who ever lived in Jerusalem. He was more famous than Saul. He was more famous than his father David. He was more famous than any of the judges or any of the prophets. He was known the world over for his wisdom and his wealth. The Queen of Sheba came to him to test him of his wisdom. But even that did not satisfy. When I was a child, I remember hearing in school my teachers saying things like, the American dream is real. You can be anything you want to be. You can do anything you want to do. And as a child, I sometimes dreamt of being the President of the United States, or of being a famous singer or musician. Now, those dreams were not realized for a number of reasons, but I also changed my dreams. But who among us has not thought at some point, if only I got a little recognition for the work that I'm doing in the office, or at home, or on the court, or on the field? Who among us has not thought, what would it be like if I were recognized and allowed to participate in this program, or my face was on this mag, or whatever it may be? Solomon had that. And he says, it's not all it's cracked up to be. It didn't satisfy me. It didn't fill the deep longing within me. True happiness does not come from prominence. I said I would mention this. I'm sharing some thoughts today from this book. This is the 2021 Freed Hardeman Lectureship book. It's a study in the book of Ecclesiastes. The lesson is my own, but I certainly got some instruction from this book. We have a copy of it in the library. And I want to share a thought that is in the first chapter of the book. It is an illustration from the life of Michael Phelps, and the author of this chapter is Dr. Justin Rogers. He says, the most decorated Olympic athlete of all time, Michael Phelps, eventually won a record 28 medals, 23 of them gold. But in 2014, after winning just 16 medals, at this point he was the most decorated gold medalist of all time, Phelps was arrested and charged with his second DUI. During an interview with the New York Times, Phelps' longtime coach stated the following. He, that is Michael Phelps, had no idea what to do with the rest of his life. It made me feel terrible. I remember one day I said, Michael, you have all the money that anybody your age could ever want or need. You have a profound influence in the world. You have free time, and you're the most miserable person I know. What's up with that? We've probably all imagined that if we had just a little bit more money, if we'd accomplished just a little bit more, if we'd been recognized just a little bit for the things that we've done, that we might be happier. But Solomon says, I was the most famous king ever to live in Jerusalem, and I still came up empty. As a source of happiness, prominence, fame will leave you empty. Finally, Solomon says, it is not through production that happiness comes. Verses 10 and 11. And whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had expended in doing it, and behold, all was vanity and a striving after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. Solomon worked. He worked to appease his passions. He worked to make progress. He worked to acquire great possessions. And all of this made him famous. And he found pleasure in that work. But he said that pleasure was temporary. It didn't satisfy him in the long run. For many of us, there are few things quite as satisfying as a job well done. There's just something about expending your energy and your effort on a project. And when that project is complete, to take a step back and to look and say, look at what I did. That can be very satisfying. And God made us that way. He made us to enjoy the results of hard work. And in fact, the Bible honors a good work ethic. It honors the value of work. Proverbs 14, verse 23 says, in all toil there is profit, but mere talk tends only to poverty. In 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 11, Paul says, aspire to live quietly and to mind your own affairs and to work with your hands. Ephesians 4:28 says, Let the thief no longer steal, but rather let him labor, doing honest work with his own hands, so that he may have something to share with anyone in need. And the Bible honors hard work. The Bible says it's of value and that it can be satisfying. But we have to put work into its proper perspective. Jesus does this in John chapter 6. In the verses leading up to this, Jesus feeds a crowd of 5,000 people, and then he travels, and they follow him. And he addresses this group of people. And he says, when they found him on the other side of the sea, they said to him, Rabbi, when did you come here? And Jesus answered them, Truly, truly, I say to you, you are seeking me, not because you saw signs, but because you ate your fill of the loaves. Then he makes this statement in verse 27. Do not work for the food that perishes, but for the food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you. For on him God the Father has set his seal. Then they said to him, What must we do to be doing the works of God? Jesus answered them, This is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he has sent. Work is satisfying, work is necessary, and there is good in it. But there is a work that is even greater and more important than our physical labor. Solomon tried to find happiness in the things that he produced, in the work of his hands. But he says, ultimately, I came up empty. It was like trying to bottle up and catch the wind. So where does true happiness come from? If it's not in our physical passions, if it's not in progress, if it's not in possessions or prominence or production, where do we find true happiness? As Solomon concludes the book of Ecclesiastes, he says this, chapter 12, beginning at verse 13. The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment, with every secret thing, whether it is good or evil. Only true happiness comes by being close to God, by fearing him, not his retribution, but healthy respect as a child with a father, and keeping his commandments, which Jesus says is the way that we show God our love. Happiness comes by drawing close to God and being in a right relationship with him. And that all begins because of a sacrifice that Jesus made on the cross 2,000 years ago for you and for me. He died to pay the penalty for our sin, to bridge the gap that's created by our own rebellion and imperfection, so that we could be in a relationship with God, so that we could love him and serve him faithfully. By that sacrifice, God extends an invitation to every person that if they will believe that Jesus is the Christ and turn away from sin and confess his name, be baptized in water for the forgiveness of sins, they will be made new through the blood of Christ. They will be made a child of God, a member of God's household, a part of God's family and kingdom. And we can know through that relationship that God has provided true happiness in our present life, content whatever our circumstances may be, and true happiness in eternity in the presence of God. God invites you this morning to know that happiness as we stand and sing together.